You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacob. My guest today is Francis J. Beckwith. He's a philosopher and a professor of philosophy. He teaches and writes in the area of law, politics, ethics, and religion. He teaches at Baylor University. He teaches a law and religion class there, philosophy and constitutional issues, philosophy of law, contemporary moral problems. He's the author of over 100 academic articles, book chapters, reference entries, and reviews. Some of his books are Politics for Christians, which perhaps we'll speak about today, Never Doubt Thomas, The Catholic Aquinas as Evangelical and Protestant, Defending Life, a Moral and Legal Case Against Abortion, et cetera, et cetera. Many, I believe over 20 books. So very, very prolific career. Francis, welcome and thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. If you would tell me a bit about, your background, perhaps how you came to faith, if you're comfortable talking about that, and why you focus on the areas you do today.
Yeah. So I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. Was born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents moved to Vegas in the mid-1960s, and I grew up in a Catholic home. And when I was in elementary school, I was one of these kids that really liked to ask questions about what we would call issues in faith and reason. And so I found myself, always asking questions to my teachers. I apparently had a philosophical bent when I was quite young. Ultimately, I drifted away from the Catholic Church and spent most of my life up until 16 years ago. I considered myself a evangelical Protestant, and then returned to the Catholic Church in 2007. The issues, the things that really initially interested me in philosophy were the kind of common faith and reason questions, like, is it reasonable to believe in God? Is it reasonable to believe in miracles? Things of that sort of kind of conventional faith and reason questions. In fact, I did my doctoral dissertation at Fordham University on David Hume's argument against miracles. So I always had an interest in sort of issues that kind of intersected between science and religion, questions like that. And then after graduate school, I was hired at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I got to teach for about 7 years where I grew up. And the chair of the department asked if I'd be willing to teach courses in moral and political philosophy. And I had an interest in that, but it wasn't really something that was central. But then I began teaching in that area, and eventually my scholarship kind of drifted into those areas as well. And eventually I went on to law school at Washington University at the end of the 90s, the beginning 2000s. And in 2003, I was hired by Baylor University and have been here ever since. So I think I'm not as interested in those sort of faith and reason questions in the conventional sense, but I think I've drifted more to asking those questions within the context of law and politics.
So what's an example? What is like one of the thorniest and most interesting questions that you've been wrestling with recently?
Yeah. So one issue that, interests me because I think it kind of reflects my own internal struggle. I tend to, at least in terms of my own kind of political philosophy, I tend to be a kind of conventional liberal in the sense that I believe in liberal democracy. I think that consent of the governed, having a constitution that's ratified by the people, representative democracy that protects fundamental rights, all that, I sort of believe all those things. And I also believe that it's a bad idea to have a kind of unification of church and state. So I sort of, in that sense, I'm a kind of conventional liberal. On the other hand, though, I also think that religious citizens should not be prohibited from making the best arguments they can for their views in the public square. And I know there are a lot of people who think that the second view that I hold sort of implies that I should reject the first one. But I don't. I think there is a consistency between them. But it's something that I kind of wrestle with, because I do think that something like religious liberty is a fundamental right that should be protected by the government. On the other hand, I also hold to the view that citizens should not be marginalized because of the views they hold. So it's so I do think, in this sense, I find myself kind of an orphan politically. I find, so I'm not, I don't agree with certain authors that defend what is sometimes called integralism, the kind of view that, at least in Catholic circles, that we should strive to have a kind of state that has a relationship to the church in a way in which the church has authority over certain aspects of government activity. I reject that view.
At the same time, it seems like in the West, I'll call it, views from religious people, whatever they may be, seem to be laughed at, shouted down, ignored, called crazy, etc. Like, demonized and, epithets thrown on it, and just really not considered. So I don't know, is there a balance there, or like, what do you?
Yeah. So I think that, when those sorts of things are brought up, I mean, I think a lot of times when people sort of have that hostility, I'm not sure that they're as acquainted with the intellectual credentials of religion. That is, a lot of it has to do with just not having read enough. So I published a book 8 years ago that actually deals somewhat with a couple of chapters deal with this question of, the title of the book is Taking Right Seriously, RITES, and it's about the relationship between faith, reason, and politics. And so one of the chapters, I go through how certain legal scholars will depict religious beliefs, and they are so foreign from the way in which at least most religious believers understand their own beliefs. So to give you an example, there's a writer, legal scholar named Brian Leiter, who's University of Chicago, a very distinguished legal scholar, published a book about 10 years ago called Why Tolerate Religion. And so one of the points he makes in the book, or one of the points that he argues for, is that religious beliefs are insulated from the evidence. That is, when somebody holds to a religious belief, they sort of come up with ways to deal with anomalies. And at the end of the day, religious beliefs are not falsifiable, to sort of use an old way of talking about this.
Even to say, like, the evidence suggests that there's this body of pristine stuff called evidence that is the standard by which everything should be judged, and religion's apart from that. They have no evidence, etc. It seems like that.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's interesting that so one of the points he makes in the book, he talks about, he quotes from another legal scholar whose name escapes me, who refers to the sort of insulation of the evidence as faith. And so one of the first things that I bring up in the book chapter is, well, there's a whole long intellectual tradition, at least within Christianity and Judaism, and to a certain extent Islam, dealing with, well, what does it mean to have faith? And he doesn't seem acquainted with that. And so and you mentioned the issue of evidence. I mean, what counts as evidence, right? So is it, we think of evidence as something we point to prove something, but most of us believe lots of things based on authority. Or, I mean, I couldn't tell you, for example, I mean, I believe in the heliocentric view of the solar system, but I couldn't really prove it to you. I mean, I would probably just appeal to the fact that I have astronomer friends that I trust. Right. So, and I think most of our beliefs are like that. I think if we really thought about it, I mean, even think of my own writings. I mean, I cite other people, right? I cite other people who I think are authorities, people that, say they have the data or the evidence, but I've never actually, let's say, examined firsthand ancient documents, right? I read books about people who say that they've seen them, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, so I think there's a lot more going on when we talk about evidence. than just sort of the kind of courtroom view of evidence. But yeah, so I do think one of the problems is just the authors that write in these areas that are kind of dismissive of religion. My experience has been is they just haven't read the literature that's out there. And I think it's, I think it has a lot to do with, just our plausibility structures. So think about, I'll use myself as an example. When I returned to the Catholic Church 16 years ago, the most frequent question I received through email from strangers was, well, why didn't you consider Eastern Orthodoxy? And I just thought, never occurred to me, because I'd grown up Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. My parents had brought me up in the church. As a Protestant, I felt I was in schism with Rome. It never occurred to me. Now, did I not do my intellectual due diligence in not examining Eastern Orthodoxy more carefully? I don't know. So I think in here, and this is in fairness to my friends that are highly critical of religion, I just think a lot of times it's the lack of examination is just because they just don't think it's initially plausible to begin with.
If one is going to criticize something or someone or some thought process, you should at least invest some time in it to see if your criticisms are valid, or you're not just listening to the dogma that's around, or some mysterious person telling you that this is what you should believe.
Yeah, there's a kind of an echo chamber. I think this is something probably more severe than it was 20 or 30 years ago. We just don't read oftentimes people that we disagree with. I mean, the way in which social media is constructed now, you get these messages like you'd be interested in this or that, right? Because they figure out the sites that I frequently go to, right? And that sort of insulates me, from, you have to sort of make an effort now to actually seek out, especially again in social media. You're right about scholars who do write about, who are critical of points of view. They should obviously read those points of.
So I don't know, when your friend or whoever it was said to you, why are you a certain kind of Christian or a certain kind of Catholic? I don't know how to put it best. What was your answer after you reflected on it? Or did you just say, well, I don't know, I'm busy?
Yeah, no, it had to do with the fact that I grew up in a Catholic family. My parents had baptized me. And so to me, it was when I left the church as a youngster, in a sense, I was in schism with that church. I wasn't in schism with Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, of course, the Eastern Orthodox person would say, well, no, we've got it right, and you should have taken the time, but it never seemed to be a live option. So I think there's a great little essay by William James, the great American philosopher who was at Harvard for I think virtually all his career. It's called The Will to Believe. And one of the things that James says in it is that we sometimes, the reason why certain ideas don't occur to us as possible avenues of belief is that we just don't think they're live options. And so how a view becomes plausible to people is that it kind of becomes a live option. The other thing is that we sometimes, this is another insight that James had that was really interesting, is that sometimes we're more afraid of error than we are loving the truth. And so for him, he that's why he calls the article "The Will to Believe." That at some point you have to sort of take a stand. Like you have to, there's a point at which you just can't wait for all the evidence to come in. You have to act. And James was one of many early 20th century, late 19th century philosophers who were called pragmatists, right? And that's why they were called that, right? It was very much the emphasis was on sort of pragmatic action.
Okay. I don't know. It just seems like people's inclination would be, they want a shorthand. They want a shortcut. They don't want to sit there and think deeply about everything, or they can't, or they don't have time, or there's competing things in their life. So I don't know, how does anyone make progress on people just saying, religion, there's no evidence for it, they're crazy, goodbye.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you have to take seriously religious beliefs that have had a deep influence on the formation of culture. So think, for example, the ways in which so many of our sort of contemporary sentiments about mercy and forgiveness, even our sort of more liberal inclinations about tolerance, I think ultimately have roots in a kind of general biblical worldview. Even if one sort of reject the underlying, beliefs, that in a way, the way in which sort of even people that may not share those religious beliefs approach a civil society, I think there's a lot of that influence. So I think you have to take seriously those beliefs that were also held by some of the smartest people who have ever lived. So to me, for something that I have not really, I really hadn't read a lot on until maybe 5, 10 years ago, is I've been reading more about Islam and Islamic philosophy. And part of it has to do with my reading of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas cites and quotes from several Islamic philosophers, Averroes, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, in addition to the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides. And his citations of them, it's not just about a critique. In some cases, he agrees with them. And so he took them very seriously. And so I've been reading more of an Islamic philosophy, and actually about 7, 8 years ago, published a series of articles, some in academic venues, some in popular venues, addressing the question, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And so I came to the conclusion they do, although I don't think they share the same faith. So I make a distinction between faith and sort of the doctrine of God. So I do think that if people are going to be seekers, that they probably should start with those faiths that have had the biggest influence on the history of civilization, even influencing art, music, literature, law. And even if you find yourself, disagreeing with some of those doctrines, I think you have to take them quite seriously.
Well, would you say that both Jews and Christians and Muslims all worship the same God?
I do. What I mean by that is that if you think of, because obviously they disagree. So let me sort of start with the disagreement. So where Muslims and Christians and Jews disagree is primarily on the doctrine of the Trinity. Christians hold that their God is one substance in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jews and Muslims disagree with that. But they do agree that there is only one being who has underived existence from which all creation has come. And there can only be one kind of being like that. In fact, it's even weird to refer to God as one of a kind. In classical Christian, Jewish, and Muslim philosophy, God is not one of a kind. He's not like the last saber-toothed tiger. He is the being from which all kinds derive their existence. And so if there can only be one sort of being like that by nature, and each of those three faiths accept that, then it has to be the same God. So I give several different kind of illustrations in my writings on this. So one of the things that, at least in sort of contemporary Christian apologetics, you have a kind of method that is typically employed. Usually the writer begins with arguments for God's existence. So the method is, okay, we first show that God exists, and then we move on to, show that certain distinct aspects of Christian theology are true, like the deity of Christ, the resurrection, and so forth. But if you first establish that there is a God, and that God has that which has underived existence, well, then you're at the same place as Muslims and Jews, right? That's so the difference, I argue, is that Christians hold that there are certain things about God's nature that are revealed in Scripture that Jews and Muslims reject. And that has to do with, obviously, the nature of Jesus and that God is triune. And I give another story that I tell in two of my book chapters is a case of three college students who all are in a philosophy class. And I give them different, I think I have Ahmed, Benjamin, and Catherine. So Ahmed, Benjamin, and Catherine are all in philosophy class. they all wind up arriving in philosophy class as atheists, but then they come to the conclusion after reading Maimonides, Avicenna, and Aquinas that there exists one God, creator of all that exists. But none of them belong to any religion. In other words, they're just philosophical belief. But then what happens is they're unsatisfied with that, so they go and examine the different religions, and Ahmed becomes a Christian, Benjamin becomes a Muslim, and Catherine becomes. Have they changed gods? And my argument is no. What they've done is they've actually, at least from each of their perspectives, think that they've learned more about the one true God they discovered through philosophy. So that's how I try to come up with ways to explain it. So, I mean, of all the things I've written, I probably have had more, at least online criticism of that than anything else, which is really shocking to me, and mostly from Christians who think that I'm totally wrong about this. So yeah, so that's that's pretty much the a kind of short version of the case I made.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't know. Now that you're probably very well versed in Christianity, but you're also studying Islam, and Judaism is definitely a part of Christianity, it appears. What's your perspective now? Why do so many people believe in the Muslim faith, and at the same time there's so many people that believe in the Christian faith, and at the same time there's so many people that believe in the Jewish faith? Like, why would these things coexist? And I know it's impossible.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of times, I mean, this is true of not only our religious beliefs, but most of our beliefs are the result of how we were brought up, right? I mean, I ask my students when I teach political philosophy, why do you think that constitutional democracy is the best form of government? Well, first off, I ask them, which is the best form of government? And I say, is monarchy a good form of government? Nobody raises their hand. And then I get to liberal democracy or constitutional democracy. They go, yes. Then almost all of them raise their hand. And I say, why? And they find it really difficult to defend because they were just brought up that way. And so I think that for vast majority of people that were brought up, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, they believe that because that's the way they were brought up. But that's also, again, that's true of a lot of our other beliefs. But people do convert, right? People do change their minds. And so you find, obviously, people that are converts to any one of those faiths. And within each of them, there are different denominations or different strands of them. I do think that, I think that there are obviously attractive elements to each of those faiths. And I think it's a mistake for people to sort of be dismissive of, I was actually at an event not too long ago. It was a Christian event, and it involved several, there were young people there, mostly college students, and there was a speaker. I was in the audience just observing. One of the students asked the speaker, who was talking about Islam, why do people convert to Islam? And he couldn't give a good answer. And one of his answers, well, a lot of women convert to Islam because they're getting married to Muslim men. And I just thought that was a really bad answer because look, if you're, let's say, a young person who's grown up in let's say a highly secularized society where there's no sort of discussion of, let's say, ultimate meaning or the transcendent, and somebody comes to you and, let's say, says, look, here's a faith that's been around for 1400 years, all these really smart people believed it, and it talks about that being obedient to God. That's really attractive, right? I mean, I think in a sense, to a certain extent, we're all looking for some kind of ultimate meaning, or even if we're not conscious of it, we sort of gravitate oftentimes to movements or causes that are bigger than ourselves and then people. So I do think that something like Islam can be quite attractive. I thought the answer given by the speaker was a terrible answer. Because I know people that have converted to Islam. I do know one who did convert because of his spouse, but I've known people that are intellectual converts, and they are serious people. And so I think it's a mistake for people to be dismissive. I think I actually enjoy reading people's autobiographies of their conversions, and I've read mostly Catholic ones. I've not read any books of converts to other faiths, but I do think we we shouldn't underestimate the draw of faiths that actually, I think that the thing that I think a lot of maybe Westerners are dismissive about is especially with more traditional faiths, the premium put on obedience. And we think, well, that's going to limit my autonomy, and I don't want to do that. And we put such a premium on autonomy. But, as one of my friends said, who was a convert, he said, I've tried my autonomy for 40 years. It's about time someone else has a chance.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which people, we have to be careful, when we're discussing conversions. There's a lot more going on than just, it's not entirely sort of rational deliberation, but it's not entirely irrationally.
Yeah. What about the different denominations within Christianity? Why do people, why are they a Baptist versus a Catholic versus a Seventh-day Adventist, et cetera? Why do you think that happens?
I think it's the same kind of story. I think people will grow up. I mean, obviously the history of Christianity gives us at least an account of why it begins, right? So at least in the West, it really begins in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation. And there the divisions multiply, and the divisions also are deeply connected to culture and government. And so Martin Luther ultimately is successful, at least in terms of standing his own ground and separating. He winds up his goal of reforming the Catholic Church doesn't quite work, right? He's eventually excommunicated, but Lutheranism only flourishes because it's protected by the German princes. So you have this sort of connection between politics, religion, and then those differing views that eventually develop on how to interpret scripture, the role of tradition. And you also have this idea, at least with the radical Reformation, of trying to get back to what they think was original Christianity. And so what happens, though, is that those different faiths, at least initially, people that, they separate as either adults or children from the Catholic Church, but then generations of people, are born, grow up, and they just, they grow up in those denominations, and what they learn about the other denominations is within their own faith, right? And so I do think that a lot of the divisions, I don't think I think those divisions persist because, over time, people don't know anything else. Right? That's simply the way they grew up. I mean, I'm one of the rare people that, I left my Catholic faith and then returned. And what amazes me is how much I didn't know about Catholicism, even though I grew up that way.
You mean when you came back, then you went in more seriously and learned?
Yeah. I think that happens with a lot of people. So, one of the things I'm careful about, as a Catholic I teach at a Baptist university. I've had students every once in a while. Not. I guess it's been a couple of years now, but I had a student years ago who came to my office, and he and his wife were thinking about becoming Catholic, and he was actually a Baptist minister. And at the time, I still had not returned to the Catholic Church, and I was careful though, because it occurred to me, well, what if it turns out that the only kind of Christianity that he finds to be plausible is Catholicism? Supposing he's leaving the Baptist world because he just doesn't think the Baptist faith is plausible, right? And so what if I talked him out of becoming Catholic, right? Have I now talked him out of Christianity? So I think there's something that never occurred to me until that moment that for some people, if you're trying to sincerely convert them to your version of Christianity, and it turns out that you wind up actually planting seeds of doubt, but they don't come to your faith. They just don't believe in anything anymore, right? So is that really the right move? I know, for example, of people that grew up Catholic who could never imagine, let's say, becoming an evangelical. They just find that to be just absolutely crazy, right? But and they're not living a fully Catholic life. Let's say they're lapsed Catholics, but they still identify as Catholic, right? So in a way, to try to convince them to leave the Catholic Church to become an evangelical, you may convince them to just leave Catholicism, period. Right? So My point is that there's a lot more going on than just arguments.
Okay. We don't have a ton of time, but what's one more issue that you wrestle with, maybe for quite a long time that you feel like you've got some additional insights into because you've studied it for so long?
Yeah, great question. Maybe it's not so much an academic issue, but I think it's just dealing with people that I've always thought when I was younger. I'm now 62 years old. I always thought, once I hit my 40s or 50s, I'll be in the world of adults and people will be sort of together and know exactly what they're doing. And the thing is that it's just not like that.
I thought
That,
so too, yeah.
I just
I
thought,
kind of laugh at myself because I thought when I was, a teenager, like 16, 17, oh man, I'm going to be in the adult world and, adults are responsible and they're so serious and they run things right. And, now that I'm in late 40s, I laugh, but yeah.
yeah, so that's the one thing that really stands out is I didn't realize how easy it was just ask for things. Like so or that the world of adults actually involves a lot more kind of intangible skills and just personal relationships that are beyond the rules. I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but so I used to think like when I look back to like when I first entered the job market and got job offers, like I didn't know like that I could actually like negotiate things. I was just happy to get a job, right? And that there's a lot, and now I realize that there's so much more going on, that you can persuade people and convince them by just being nice, right? And things that if I had to sort of tell the next generation of and not that I always follow it, but it's something it's not an academic topic, but it's just so the other thing that I've discovered, I think this could sort of tie into academics, is I've actually become friends with people with whom I disagree. And that has been a real eye opener just to like reach out to people and like I've ongoing back and forth with David Boonin at the University of Colorado. Began probably in the late 90s. He and I have written books on abortion and we disagree with each other on this strongly. And yet I've gotten to be really good friends with David. He's invited me to give a talk at University of Colorado. When I spent a year there 8 years ago as a visiting professor, we went hiking together. I've contributed to 2 of his books. He's been a reference for me, and and it's interesting when you get to know people, even if you still wind up disagreeing, it's made my writing better. There's nothing technical about it, but it's just that now when I write and I'm critical of David, he's a real person, right? And so I little things like that, I think, that have really changed. I mean, look back to some of the things I wrote when I was younger. They're cringe inducing. I go, oh my God, I actually said that. Even though I don't necessarily disbelieve it anymore, but I could have been nicer. I could have said it with a little bit more grace, right? So the things like that, I think as I've gotten older, I realize, are as important as having an airtight argument.
Okay. Well, that's excellent that you're open to friendships with people that don't share your views, and that's very refreshing. So, well, very good, Francis. We're out of time, but you've got a lot of really interesting thoughts and many publications. Where can someone start if they want to hear more from you? Like, where can they go, and how should they start to learn more?
Yeah, so just go to my website, francisbeckwith.com. That's FrancisBeckwith.com. And there's you can get the links to a lot of my articles. I have a page on SSRN, which is the Social Science Research Network. You can sort of Google SSRN and my name, and there's about a dozen of PDFs of some of my published articles and a few papers that haven't been published.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, Francis, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.